Welcome everyone to Public Interest Technology 502. This is Co-Designing the Future. I'm Katina Michael, your instructor, and today I have the absolute joy of welcoming Reese Farthing to our class. Reese, hello.
Hello, welcome.
Where are you, Reese?
I'm in Sussex at the moment, so in the south of England, just about an hour below London where I live.
That's fantastic, and obviously
it's the start of spring here, so you might in the background hear a few bird chirps. Even it's quite definitely delightful at the moment.
That's fantastic to hear. Well, I'm in Australia. It's raining here at the moment, but it's been a lovely summer between the rain and the sunshine. What I love about PIT is it's truly global, and that's how we met. We met through a standard called IEEE 2089, which I'll get you to talk about soon. But firstly, how would you introduce yourself to the students?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I always just tend to tell people that my background or what I work on is intergenerational justice. And I specifically work with young people to address this. And at the moment, I think how you and I met is that my focus has really been around sort of socio-technical policy and looking at actually regulations and legislations that need to work to improve intergenerational justice.
You know, I didn't know much about all of this stuff until I met you. And then I was catapulted sort of at the same time into the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, where I was tasked to create this new degree. But our first encounter, I think, was on Holborn Street in London, and you came to deliver some goodies. And in those documents were these brilliant pieces that summated the state of play of so many things to do with rights of children and just rights in general. Can you tell us about your day job?
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, I work for Five Rights Foundation, which is a campaigning NGO in the UK. And what we work on is trying to create the digital world that young people deserve. And so that's through international regulation and legislation. So we're working with the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child to implement a general comment on children's rights in the digital world. So that's a sort of codicil to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In the UK, we worked on developing and implementing the age-appropriate design code, which is a sort of really progressive piece of regulation and now legislation around children's data protection. And we advise sort of other areas and other jurisdictions that are looking at creating similar codes. And then we do a lot of work around co-regulation as well. So we work on standards, as you've mentioned, that's where we met. And we also do a lot of, I guess, public policy work and parliamentary work to try and sort of create, child online safety as well as children's data protection, and really trying to create a sort of holistic framework of supports and regulations to make sure that the digital world is as good as it can be for young people.
It's an amazing thing to meet someone that works full-time on the rights of children and on young people as an area of expertise. I've met wonderful students who are mature students who, dovetailed the MBA and came in straight to the Masters of Public Interest Tech because they work on issues to do with gender violence, or they work on mental health issues like suicide, or disability and access services and equity, or on homelessness and poverty, or on the rights of the Indigenous or Aboriginal people or Native persons. And what's been amazing is that through this adventure, through the eyes of the students, I'm coming to an awareness that our toolkits are becoming more sophisticated towards these different causes. And so where there is no toolkit, I say to the students, well, off you go. You've got to create the toolkit, the design toolkit. And that's what we're here to talk about today, co-design. Can you tell us what is co-design in your eyes and what does it mean for you?
I feel a little bit underqualified in a course about co-design to give a definition, but I think at its most top line for me, I think it's like an approach or a loose set of methods or a methodology that attempts to encourage and engage all of the different stakeholders in the design process And at its most banal, where I see it used quite often in the commercial sector, that just means, you know, oh, we create better services to create products that people want. Or at its most radical, which is where I tend to, I hope I tend to use, and I encourage other people to think about it this way. I think it's an action like a democratic act that's rooted in definitely in fairness, and sometimes if we do it right, in justice. And I think I say that, I sort of go for these big flag, it's about democracy, because I fundamentally believe that all artifacts that we have, whether it's a digital product, a physical product like a pen, or a policy product, which is what I work on, somehow they kind of embody or embed the politics of their creation in them as well. And so if you actually want them to reflect fairness or justice, you need to create them right. And I think that's where co-design or participatory design really takes its own shape. And if I can, I'm just going to unpack the language that I use a little bit around that. Please. So I know that people use co-design a lot. I tend to use participatory design. I'm not entirely sure, I've got to admit, what the difference is between them, especially now as they're kind of used in today's day and age. But I know that co-design, as I understand it, and again, you might know different, so correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's a lovely sort of portmanteau of, cooperative design, which is where I've seen it being used a lot, was in like the 60s and the 70s in Scandinavia, in the kind of labour movement over there, where they were thinking about trying to design their management systems. And they had this idea that you actually want managers and workers to work together and create these systems. And so you cooperatively design them. And you can see in that, as you sort of say, that the legacy of the cooperative movement, the legacy of the mutualistic political movement is in there, which is why I always kind of giggle so much when I see these commercial products that are flat out just sort of trying to make money, in the sort of capitalist sense, doing co-design, because I'm like, actually, that's kind of the exact opposite of what this is rooted in and where it's bedded in. Whereas the language that I use around participatory design, I think stems from a process of what in academia is sometimes called participatory action research. So that PAR acronym that turns up a lot. And PAR, I think it's rooted in, like, there's a lot of democratic theory around it. It's really old stuff, like John Dewey in the US, and later Paulo Freire, who's one of my favorite academics. And that kind of had this idea that democracy is an act. It's a doing. What's a doing word? A verb? Yes, democracy is a verb. And you need to sort of focus on justice and, if you can, fairness. And it's this sort of base claim for, like, franchise. It's like, yes, everyone should vote, but everyone beyond that should be involved in everything. Everyone should have their say. And so people should participate and get involved in sort of everything. And I think where they sort of link now is that both see the end user, if you will, not just as either, like in co-design, as you would like a test user, or in research as a subject. The idea is that actually they're co-designers, they're co-researchers with you, and you have to involve them right the way throughout the process. And so in my field, I tend to use participatory design, and I think that's probably just because in the youth sector, in the youth field, participation has a really long and rich academic history, and so people understand that. But I also need to navigate in a world that's dominated by design speak, and I still need to work and have people understand me. And so I slip and use co-design sometimes in participatory design, but I sort of think they mean the same thing, if you will.
Yes, we've been delving in this session already. We're in sort of week 3 of 7.5 weeks in this intensive mode. Whether there is a distinction, whether there's a dotted line, whether we hope one day we will get to a co-design mode whereby we can empower users enough that they lead their own projects and see their own implementations. But that takes incredible effort in terms of education and expertise. We had this tug of war in class last week where someone said, you know, I'm a user experience designer. I'm a professional. I have professional expertise in this domain. What do you mean I take these users on a journey with me and then they co-lead and then they're the leaders? I've empowered them enough when they don't have the expertise to develop the right interfaces.
Yeah, and I think that's the critical question, right? Like, and if you take a sort of justice and fairness lens to that, it becomes even more problematic because the question that you get, or the question that you constantly come back to is, who gets to design and what do they design, right? And so there's this whole expertise and skills that you bring to it. But actually, if it's about justice and fairness, it's about actually working together and ceding power. And you start to see that a lot of this is actually really difficult in practice. And I think, I don't know, I mean, I take a really radical view on this because I can and I would, you know. But I think that there's this wonderful quote from Ruha Benjamin. You know, she wrote that incredible book, Race After Technology. And there's this chapter in it that goes into like, how do we create solutions and what do we need? And she's quite critical about design speak and design theory. And one of the things she constantly says is that you need to remind yourself that you know, co-design, design theory, design speak wrongly claims newness in a lot of ways. And in doing so, when you sort of wrongly claim that this is a new thing that you've discovered and you know how to do it, it actually, it can be a bit difficult because it can erase the insights and agency of everyone who else could be involved. And you sort of discount them because they're not considered designers. And so it's this sort of difficult tension that you have of realizing that actually I've got this incredible skill set and years of experience and I know how to do this. But actually, what does that, you know, if you're sort of holding on to that, what does that say about other people that like, oh, well, they don't have those skills, so they can't do it. And it's like, actually, they have been designing everything their whole life. You know, every part of the human experience is designed in a lot of ways. And so it's that balancing act of how do you recognize what, for me, young people can bring to the table and really enable and value their expertise, and how do you support them to actually create the change that they want to see in the world? And it's really, really tricky. It's not easy.
Yes, when we were getting to the discovery stage, I balanced out the number of phases. I mean, you look at any co-design or participatory design process and it can be as little as 3 steps or 12, you know, it depends on the kind of flowchart you're looking at. But we settled on one that fit our sort of session of our intensive. We have 6 sort of steps and I compared 15 different models. And then on the 7th is a demonstration day of what the students have come up with their public interest challenge. And in that discovery stage, we asked, well, how many touch points are there with users? Is it truly co-design? How do we know? We see the user twice a day. You know, we consult with them on every, you know, little minor change. Do we see them 3 times during the process on an ad hoc basis? When is a project ever finished? Is it iterative? So we asked these philosophical questions and reflections. But one of the most beautiful things, I was at the beach and bumped into my eldest son's early childhood teacher, who knew him at 3 years of age. And it was a family-owned business in the town that I live in. And it was one of the most beautiful reunions. I had just done 3 interviews with Matthew Mitka from Greater Than Learning and asking the same questions that you're asking today, almost. And I said to Annie, how do you know in early childhood, what is it with the users? You know, who are the users? Who are the stakeholders? She goes to me, Kat, obviously it's the children, but it's also the parents. And you've got to know your parents. You've got to know your parents intimately. You've got to know what their boundaries are. You've got to know how they interact and, you know, what wouldn't sit well with them and what would be okay with them and what is acceptable to the children. And it blew my mind talking to her because it's something I had just written in lecture notes, that your user can't be at arm's length. You've got to be able to break bread and be in situ with them, to see their life world, to understand where they're coming from. Because if you're a consultant in the other side of the world saying, I've got these great design principles and we're going to go through the 10 steps of organization Y, Z, and ABC. We can do it for you. You know, that's like a sales pitch. But I think you've got to be so proximate that it becomes the word partnership. I think you raised in your participatory action research, but I'm seeing this language come up now through Mission Publics and through many other organizations. Partnership.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It really is about it's about a power switch. And I think part of the reason that, you know, way back at the beginning, I said I stick to the language of participatory design, because I think we're quite privileged in my field. So working with young people, youth participation has a really long and rich academic history that highlights exactly that issue of partnership, which is where I think a lot of co-design stuff, where I get a bit sort of uncomfortable with it, is from where I sit with my academic history. I just don't see how it is actually participation. And I think, you know, as a sort of top line to give an introduction to where sort of youth participation comes from, one of our sort of seminal thinkers, one of the like seminal thinkers in this space was a guy called Roger Hart, and he borrowed from Sherriano's thing. And back in the 70s or 80s, he created this ladder of participation. And I think if you work in sort of, you know, as a youth worker or, you know, any sort of youth participation space, it's like the thing you'll see on day one of your first course is like they'll present this ladder, which basically draws up participation as a sort of a series of steps that you can go through, where at the bottom it's about, you know, there are ways that you can do participation that are actually about tokenism and not really participating, right up to the top ladder, which is citizenship. And now this ladder has been critiqued and changed and all sorts of things along the time. But basically the idea is that you can engage young people by just, you know, using them as decoration, getting a quote, getting a little picture for your promotional material or whatever, but that's not participation, right? And then you go up a little bit of the ladder in the middle and you get consultation. And that's where you ask young people what they think. And you can ask young people what they think multiple times, multiple stages, repeat, ask them what they think. And I think in the co-design space, that quite often is what gets called co-design, right? Consultation. You know, it's like we're just having these ongoing consultations. But where I come from, which is rooted in that sort of, here's our ladder, that's barely participation. It's considered one of the lowest rungs of the ladder on participation, right?
Yes.
And you can take that a little bit further. You go like one rung up on the ladder where you consult and inform young people. So you show some accountability. You actually go back to those same young people and you say, hey, look, you told us X, Y, Z, but we weren't able to do it. We did Z, we couldn't do X and Y because of this, blah, blah, blah. But you actually provide some feedback. And as you start going up this ladder, there's many more rungs. You start really seeding decision-making power, right? You start using your techniques, your methods to actually create active, equal partnerships with young people, as you put it. And so you know, like I think in a design setting for a product, it's less like, imagine, you know, I'm making product X with some, you know, that young people might use this product X. So young people, tell me how to make product X better. Use it, play with it. What changes do we need? And as you move up the ladder, that would sort of move to actually starting with a question, what product should I make, young people? You know, it's not X. You tell me from the start, right? What do you need? Or ideally from a sort of justice and fairness perspective, like what is it that you really need? Not what you want, what you need to make your lives better. Or really crazy as you start to get up that ladder, you know, working with young people in ways that's actually youth-led. So, you know, a young person could turn around and go, yo, old fogey, we want to make something we really need called product M. Can you give us some advice and help us make product M, right? And I get that, like what I've just described is a really linear description. And as you pointed out, actually just like 2 minutes ago, actually design is more iterative than that. You know, you start with an initial prototype, you iterate, you change your ideas, you come up, you sort of consult at multiple stages along the way. But I guess the question that I constantly come back to is, you know, along that process where there's so many iterations and so many consultations that happens, ultimately, if you boil it down, who gets to decide, right? So in that iteration where you say, okay, we've turned up with product X is our prototype, and you have a consultation, you're like, oh no, it needs to be product M. who finally made that decision? What was the criteria that was used to choose between the iterations? And importantly, because this is all about who gets to design, who set those criteria, right? So if in the process of your consultations and your iterations and all of the things that you do in design thinking, the young users who you were working with decided that actually what we need is something that has zero commercial value for your client who you're working with, but would absolutely solve a problem that them and 3 of their friends face, would you build it? You know, and that's where you start to see that kind of radical politics of who gets to be a designer, who gets to claim that they're a designer, you know, who is privileged in the decision-making processes. And that's like a really deeply complicated thing, because the question is also, how can you do that? Especially when we all need jobs, you know, like if you've got a client who actually says, this is what we want, go and co-design this. And in the process of co-designing, actually, you work out that it's something completely different. It solves a whole set of problems for the client base that you're working with, but it's not what your client needs. At a point, you have to realize that if you're building what your client needs, your client is making the decisions, your client has power. And I'm not 100% sure that fits into co-design. But then again, I'm not 100% sure that co-design fits really neatly with this capitalist system that we've got. And so you get back to that fundamental tension of power and decision-making.
You have covered so much core material that one covers in a whole session. I just want to unpack that, if that's okay. That was like the best 10 minutes of the course so far. Let me share with you some of our reflections during office hours. Because it's a remote course, it's asynchronous, but I hold daily office hours for an hour, and people turn up every day to talk, to converse, just like we are. It's this conversation that stays with you, not so much the textbooks, though the students are reading the right things like design justice and so forth. So we get to the feasibility. You know, I come from an engineering by design background, which had nothing to do with user-led, had nothing to do with co-design, had nothing to do with consultation. It was build and they will come mentality, the opposite. And during that time, you know, I was doing a lot of business and network planning, and you had this net present value figure, you had an internal rate of return, you had a payback period, and then you had to prove feasibility. And feasibility would definitely be among 3 components: technical, operational, and economic. And that net present value figure would fall into the economic. And so what we're really talking about is that feasibility model does not work for the public interest. We have to include the societal and the environmental and perhaps other things like child impact and other things. And what I'm telling the young people enrolled in this course, some of who are mature, is you have to build the rubrics. They don't exist because no one's ever thought like this. You know, they may have thought about this, but they never did it. They never actioned it out. And so the challenge is not just investigate the public interest technology challenge itself, the problem, it's to actually introduce a means and a mechanism by which to study the phenomenon that's going on. Something that I like from what you're saying, I mean, the first thing I did when I Googled co-design in the last 2 months is I came across a 1-hour video that was dispelling that co-design is actually consultation, that consultation is not co-design. So again, back to that ladder and climbing the ladder. So the co-designers or the movement touting co-designers caught on with what you're saying, and that, you know, they've had enough of being told that it just consult and that the consultation is not co-design. So they're starting to wisen up because they're reading the participatory books. And obviously co-design has come from somewhere, right? It's come from something.
It has its own long and rich history too, you know.
That's because you're well read, right? And I say that, I'm the novice here. I'm learning a lot from everyone that I'm talking to, but there you go. You know, you mentioned originally the Scandinavian influence on the co-design, and then the action with the participatory and the political component. And I want to tell you about two people I admire greatly. One of them is Professor Jeremy Pitt at Imperial College London, who constantly talks about democracy by design. And he's saying exactly what you're saying. And the second person is Dr. Roba Abbas, who keeps talking about the operationalization of socio-technical approaches that espouse also the environmental subsystem, not just the societal and technical, but also the environmental, which is where your forte is on policy products. I also want to mention to you this notion of products, and this will go back to the way you see democracy embedded in your thinking and your critical thinking in this area. I often say from my innovation research that every product is a process, and it's the process that we're saying is the embedding of the long-standing, whatever that is, whatever thing is the outcome of this deliberation. Is the product is actually a process. And a lot of innovation people don't realize that the shiny gadget that we call the mobile phone is not just a bunch of components. There's a whole value chain that makes it exist, and a whole ecosystem.
And there's
that allows
politics,
it to function.
you know, there's politics riddled right through that, right? So like every product that you make, even your mobile phone, as you put it, you could literally break down and do a political analysis, because it's an artifact. It's an artifact of how it was created. It's an artifact of the politics of every decision that was involved. And you can read power through products, right? And so if you want to create these products that actually neutralize or you know, that sit with fairness and justice and these non-exploitative practices, your process to get there has to be rethought, revamped.
I have so much to share with you, and I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you, if we move now towards the thematic area of your engagement, tell me what it's like to work with young people.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm incredibly lucky because I find it unbelievably recharging, restorative. I mean, it could be that maybe I do, and that's why I worked at, but I think I'm luckier than any other co-designer because actually the energy and the enthusiasm that you get from young people is just is powerful enough to recharge your own batteries. So I'm deeply lucky there. And the reason I do it is I think that, you know, there are many different issues that fairness and justice need to look at, whether it's gender, race, religion. There's all sorts of intersectionalities, or, you know, matrices of oppression, if you will, whatever language you're using. And I think that generational stuff gets a little bit missed in there too often. And I think it's sad because fundamentally, I'm Australian like you, so forgive me here. I tend to use words that probably would be bleeped out elsewhere. But I really think we've screwed over the next generations. And this isn't about age, because maybe if you think you and I were both 16 once, and we couldn't vote, we had all of the things about age-based discrimination then that exist now. And so I think people think of that and they're like, oh, well, that's just part of the course, you know. And you're like, well, no, actually, that is a legitimate age-based discrimination. But when you add to that this generational lens, right, there is actually something happening to different generations, so different cohorts that are happening that will stay with them, that isn't just something that you and I both experience when we're 16, right? We are passing on things that people who are 16 now are experiencing that are never going to leave them, right? They will never have the future that we had. They will never have the benefits that we got, you know, whether it's from leaving them a looming ecological disaster, to leaving them a political system that's brittle and fragile, to leaving them a sort of welfare state that isn't as rich and isn't as fulsome. So, you know, in Australia, where you're based at the moment, our parents all had much cheaper higher education than we did. And the generation below us are paying for it even more. You know, that is a benefit that we have that we are not sharing down, right? And that's a question of fairness, but also of justice. You know, this is about sustainability and ensuring that actually what we take with us as a generation, we are able to leave something back. And so I think when I add that, or the unique perspective that working intergenerationally and working with young people sort of brings to that, is highlighting that there's a really long legacy of your design choices. You can't just think about the people who are in the room with you now when you're making these design choices. You have to think about the people who could be in the room with you in 200 years, in 300 years, right? And it's about thinking about fairness for our future generations. And that is just, I mean, it's incredibly complex. It's incredibly difficult, but you can start to think, if you did that, questions of designing things and making things with plastic, for example, would never be an option. And, you know, that's a really simple one. But if you start to think about, I work in the policy terrain, if you start to think about some of the policy decisions that we make around our welfare state, you start to see how, you know, actually, if you think about fairness and entitlement for those who are yet to be born, actually you create an incredibly different, incredibly difficult matrix to sort of reconcile. And so it's complicated and it's difficult, but it's also unbelievably fun, unbelievably worthwhile. And it certainly means you're never bored. How's that?
Definitely. I'm blessed with children, and I feel the same way every day as a parent. And I think, you know, my husband and I often say, you know, did the little one say that? You know, I couldn't have conceived of that until I was like 22 or 23 years of age. You know, did the 10-year-old say that? You know, a lot more access to information, a lot more happening up here, I think, than when I was 10 years of age. And I talk to older people who say to me, you know, I've asked my own mum, you know, what did you say to your mum and your grandmum back in the village? And my mum's going like, you know, they would never have asked that question because there wouldn't have been scope to ask that question. But our young people are asking questions very early on. I was inspired by, a couple of days ago, I heard a wonderful, wonderful panel, one of the best I've ever heard on the internet. It was run by New America's We Are the Commons group, and Eric Dawson and Sonia, can't remember her last name, from Free From, and one other gentleman, Sasha from City Mart, were talking about deliberation. That today, you know, we build these products, you know, another one. We even plan the obsolescence of them, like to chuck them out prematurely to make sure we keep getting our S-curve and our fixes economically so that we keep getting revenue streams in. And they were talking about, we've got to allow the plot to be fallow every 7 years. We should go on that sabbatical once every 3 years. We should keep the Sabbath once a week, whatever, to each person. We should, you know, just take a break. That being productive didn't mean you were always producing. That productivity was also just being, possessing yourself, you know. And I see that in you, Reese Farthing, as a researcher, as a practitioner. I see this quality in others that are close to me as well. I don't possess that, unfortunately, not yet anyway. I'm working on it. But the best I do is taking an hour or two a day out.
This all sounds like a very polite way of saying you think I'm lazy, Katina.
I know. You're the most productive person I know. You're hilarious. So the interesting thing here is going back to this longevity of design and justice and fairness. If this all is rooted, you know, in the days of DDT or plastics creation, or you know what I'm saying, this environmental disaster.
Even, you know, there's environmental disaster, but there's even looming for young people. You know, data has permanence. You know, and unlike previous generations, children are datafied from birth now, right? And data doesn't go away. You know, so that's got to live with them as well. So there's all sorts of things that people are living with now that they never had to in previous generations.
Yes. Tell us about the data a bit. I want to hear a little bit more.
I feel like I cut you off there, but I was moving beyond the ecological into the everything.
Well, this is about young people, right? This conversation. Well, so tell me.
True. I mean, data is an interesting one because it can be used for good and it can be, you know, harmful, and it can be all sorts of things. But I sort of try and move beyond like, how is it used, just to think about, well, what's the effect of its collection, right? And you were talking about, you know, yourself when you were 10 and your grandma when she was 10. And then I think about 10-year-olds now, and I think that one of the privileges intergenerationally that your grandma, my grandma, you, me, possibly a lot of your students had, I'm assuming that you're not teaching any bright young sort of doogie houses who are sort of like under 12 yet.
Not yet. Yeah.
Is that when we were young, we all had this kind of ability or this space to be let alone, you know, to like think our thoughts, to do our thing, to kind of experiment in what we did without surveillance, right? Like we could try out thinking and saying new things without much consequence.
Yes.
Right, you could sort of, you know, you could flirt a little bit with being a communist if you wanted. You could flirt a little bit with being really pro-market. You could think all of these like crazy and radical thoughts when you're a kid. Like whether, you know, I don't mean that many 10-year-olds are like flat out, you know, like, oh, great, yes, like Marx's manifesto. But, you know, like you'll have thoughts about this sort of things or these sorts of things, right? And that's part of the process of finding yourself, part of the process of experimenting and working out who you are. And I think, you know, because of the massive datafication and the permanence of that data, right, I think one of the things we're not thinking about often enough for our future generations is like, what are the real political, and I mean like small p and big P political consequences of the next generation? Because we've got these cohorts of young people who are growing up without that free thought, without that space filled without surveillance, without the ability to think what they think without consequence, right? And if you put that in a rights-based sense, that is the right to freedom of thought, the right to that space in your own mind, or, you know, that debating chamber in your own head, and what lawyers call it, and they call it like the forum internum or something. They've got a very posh word for it, but basically means like the insides of your own head, right? That you and I had when we were young, and we could be as crazy and out there as we want without it being surveilled and without the data of that being tracked and existing somewhere, right? And even if that data is not used, even if all of the insane Google searches that 10-year-olds these days are doing aren't ever used, accessed, they know that they're tracked. They know that it's surveilled, right? Like there's that chilling panoptic effect of knowing that everything that you think and everything that you do is kind of surveilled in some way, right? And what does it mean, right? To keep your thoughts private, to keep your brain free from manipulation and penalty, right? Which are your human rights, like the fundamental rights of forum internum are that. If you've never had the space to think freely when you were young, right? Like what does that mean going up? And so I think it's just, you know, the consequences could be really big, and they're not something that we're thinking about now. And I think increasingly, at least for me, the kind of focus on regulations and legislations that carve out some legitimate data protection for young people, you know, so carving out spaces for young people to be free from profiling, free from the consequences of automated decision making. And as we say in Europe, you know, the right to delete, or even not even exercising the right to delete, automatic deletion of your data, right? It's just so important, because that's one of these ways of protecting that space of free thought for the young. And that's the kind of regulation that Five Rights is working on at the moment around the UK Age Appropriate Design Code is really set to kind of try and do that. And Ireland's there's a consultation open now. If anyone wants to have a look at it, they've got their version of some pretty progressive children's data protection regulation out that they've called Fundamentals for Children. So that's a consultation that's live till March 31st. And I know that France and Sweden, I think, have got that not quite regulation legislation, but they've got guidance around data protection for children. I know Australia right now is very much looking at putting out a children's privacy data code. And these are the types of regulation and legislation, I think, that could rein that in a little bit. And I hope increasingly give young people back just that little bit of space, so that that not everything that they do is datafied, and that they can have this space to grow and think and emerge with different ways of being and thinking without the process feeling trapped and tracked. Because I don't know how you change your mind if you think that everything that you say and do is being monitored. And I think that's I don't know, for me, that's one of the things that's keeping me awake at night and driving driving the work that I do. So definitely where I'm spending most of my brain today.
That's so well said. And as you might know, an area of my research that I've spent maybe 20 years on, working with M.G. Michael on this notion of ubervalence, where George Orwell claimed that the only space that, was private was between the skull, the 3 cubic centimeters. And we don't have that now because we're externalizing everything out. It's becoming explicitly written in the search box or aired onto the IoT Alexa device, or somehow, by the way we breathe, monitored, with biometrics in the workplace or otherwise.
Yeah, right. And you imagine, like, for an adult, that's just overwhelming. But you and I can imagine it being different. Like, if you think about this generationally, like, can you imagine the power of not having that space of imagining that didn't happen? Not having the space to imagine those 3 square centimeters should be your own. Like, what does that mean for democracy?
Well, this notion, and again, not to pick on Google, but Google's the third half of your brain. A classic quote from the early times of their existence. The third half of your brain. I think that's important because we need room to grow. We need room to make mistakes in private and to learn from them and to keep going. I'm not talking about secrecy to the extent of criminality, not at all. I'm talking about being able to make mistakes. I know that there are links to suicide. We know that there are mental health concerns. We know that people are increasingly playing to a global theatre, changing the way they behave and their thought processes just to ensure that they maintain their privacy, like duping the technology and the system. But my husband and I wrote a paper on social media, suicide and awareness and ubervalence, looking at a couple of very high-profile deaths of adults that felt that their space had been encroached and felt they had no way out. And one of the things that Michael had written as a theologian was, would St. Augustine ever have written, the City of God, his Confessions? And would he have become a saint? Inverted commas, whatever the belief system is, take this as a metaphor, but he was trying to say, if all of his sins were recorded on YouTube and, even if they were unlisted or they were private, and he could return to them and watch them again and again and say, woe is me, I've done something really bad and I'm stuck in this endless loop, he would never have become a saint by the church, declared, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Or even, I mean, it doesn't even have to be as big as, recording your sins or your purgation. It's like, if you think about young people, think back to when you were 10, right? Would you have ever learned a guitar, like picked up a guitar? I don't know if you like guitar, recorder, whatever it was. Would you have ever picked up a guitar if you thought that every time you tried to pluck your first string, there was an audience, right? Even if you weren't putting it on YouTube or whatever, if you've never understood that there's a concept of privacy and that things can be your own, like how would you try anything new, even if it's not, criminality or sinning or these sorts of things? Like, I literally just think that narrowing down of the opportunity to try out new things, because everything seems like it's so public. You think that Google is the third half of your brain, and so you're, I think ubervalence is a great word. You've taken that on, like the panoptic lives inside you. Sorry, the panopticon lives inside you. I just think that's going to be really difficult for young people to find their new identities through, in a way that, again, you and I never had to navigate that.
Yes, and increasingly I receive emails because of this research saying, people claiming, young people in their late teens, early 20s, claiming that they're being watched constantly by implantables on the surface of the skin or embedded by their boyfriend, and we're not talking so much about psychosis here, we're talking literally about undefined areas of mental health concerns which have been propagated, in this subliminal way by the availability of these technologies to do what we're saying, datafy, and we become the product. I think we need to reverse this, and I want to stick on something that you said and get to the end of the interview, but you talked about public interest technology, and we go forward if product X was not going to make us any money. And this is exactly where I think we have to go. The things that are valuable and invaluable to society never see the light of day because usually they don't cost anything. And what we have today are companies touting free. We give you free stuff like free emails and free internet access. And they are ripping us off at the guts by advertising and other things, selling our information. And so what I really want to do is correct the business model. We need to do the opposite, and invest in things that are truly for our longevity and sustainability.
We need to go back to the cooperative movement and mutualism and see that as an alternative marketplace, you know, and take co-design back to its original roots of actually power equalization. This isn't about commercial benefit for, you know, as Marx would say, the property owners. This is actually about the public good, the commons, you know, and how do we actually enrich design for the commons.
In closing, Reese, do you have any other general comments to make that I haven't given you an opportunity to address so far?
No, I mean, I just want to take this opportunity to apologise for a rant. You know, I'm always up for a rant, and I apologise for those who listen to the rant. But also to, I guess, you know, wish everyone who's doing this course good luck. I mean, I think it's incredibly tough, it's incredibly difficult, and just unbelievably important that everyone does what they're doing. So, you know, I wish you all the luck in the world, and I hope you can do it definitely better than I'm trying to do it. And I hope that one day you can share with me some of your ideas, tools, and techniques, because I think I definitely need them.
Reese, throughout the session, we've been talking about two key qualities of a researcher in this space. One is humility, and the other is a good listener. And I think you have both those traits. I know I don't, but I think you do. And one of the things we've been reflecting on in ending is people's scholarship and depth and willingness to engage. You know, the first thing that we don't want to produce is a cross between, say, a Mother Teresa and a Steve Jobs. What we're looking for is humble leaders. As one student said in my class, Lyric Pete, the de-gurification of the people, the humility that we somehow at grassroots level mingle and intermingle and are not distinguishable by the professor, despite that you are an Oxford graduate, despite your scholarship and your depth. You've never said that. In fact, it took me a long time to figure out that you were a PhD, because you'd never say it, and you actually graduated from one of the best institutions in the world. That's what I love about you. That's what I love about you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this hour.
Thank you, and good luck, everyone.
Thank you, Reese. Bye now.